I'm really excited to be here, and thank you so much for that really nice introduction. I'm going to talk a lot about landscape urbanism and the role of landscape in our cities, and give you an introduction to our firm and just our kind of methodology and way of thinking about urbanism. I've had the opportunity to work, as has been mentioned, at the Raleigh Ironworks site here, which had been the Peden Steelworks along Atlantic Avenue. And it's been really interesting to kind of get to know the city through that particular lens, although I think my experience in a more broad context is rather limited. I think that there are things that are, let's make sure this is loading here. Really universal to cities. And sorry about that. Great, here we go. I think that there are particular strategies that we're thinking about as a firm that are universal to cities in general. I'm going to talk about how that kind of plays out and how we can bring some of those strategies and reinforce them through regional landscapes and understanding how those regional landscapes work. So at Future Green, we are a design build firm in Brooklyn, New York. This is one of our projects, Empire Stores, adjacent to Michael Van Valkenburg Park, Brooklyn Bridge Park, which I go to every day. And so I will say it's an amazing place to be, and you have a great thing coming here. I'm going to talk about situating nature on a pedestal. A lot of our work looks at landscape in cities and landscape on structure and how there might be unique ways of kind of weaving that landscape into the built environment. As had been mentioned, we're a staff of 38. We're a collection of makers, woodworkers, metalworkers, gardeners, landscape architects, artists that come together to kind of realize these bespoke, often urban landscape ecological interventions. I founded the firm in 2008. And over the years, we've begun to kind of understand that in a way, like the city is our site. I think in a way, this is like a little bit of like a post-rationalization of all this small scale work that we did. And that together, those small scale projects like a window box or a backyard or a roof don't really change the needle on sustainability or, in the city's kind of urban ecology. But when you stitch them together and you look at them as a larger urban ecological system, they begin to kind of form this patchwork ecology. And so a lot of our early process really involved looking and observing the city and where plants were naturally taking root and spontaneously taking root, and using those as kind of inspiration. So that included photography and mapping, and kind of understanding where these plants were growing, what the conditions were, and how those might be resilient strategies to then employ and weave into our own built work. And so it's that kind of approach that we've taken to kind of understanding that the city can exist through a series of kind of built typologies, right? All these kind of different landscape interventions that we can apply to the city are looked at somewhat almost like in an index. Again, on their own, maybe not making spaces, but when you kind of smash them together, they create these kind of human and ecological services. And so our work is really sat at the nexus of design. This is the Brooklyn Children's Museum. Of research, our book in 2016, Spontaneous Urban Plants, Weeds in New York City. Of fabrication, this was a collaboration with the artist Dan Graham for the rooftop of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2013, where we really supported his vision, engineered the project, and built it. Work in our local community of Red Hook, Brooklyn. This is called the 2,000 Gallon Project, where we looked at how much each of these containers could absorb in terms of stormwater management. And then a larger kind of citywide research and revisioning of our public spaces. And, not just public spaces that we traditionally think about. We're often interested in these kind of spaces in between. So, large parks and preserved lands are often traditional components of the urban landscape, but often overlooked and perhaps more ubiquitous are the opportunities found in walls, roofs, lots, and streets. These smaller scale interventions, when stitched together, contribute to the ecological performance and livability of the city. I mean, I think we all saw that, especially during the pandemic, as streets became a much more kind of viable used public space. And so, one of the things we've been thinking about is that streets and sidewalk often make up a large percentage of our urban fabric, roughly 25% in many cities. So there's a huge potential within that fabric to kind of flip that narrative on its head and be in more service to people and ecology. And so these are just brief images that kind of list out like the typologies of landscape that we're considering in the city. So green roofs and window boxes, planted canopies over the entrances of buildings, rooftop sculpture gardens or green roofs that provide deep-rooted areas for stormwater management and can support, larger forests, in this case an aspen grove, deeper courtyards of buildings, learning how to work with shade and the spaces in between buildings to still provide lush garden environments. Taking, corners of streets and beginning to kind of eat away, giving these things road diets and reclaiming that space for more inclusive space, again, in service to ecology. Looking at streets and planting islands as connective corridors. Broadway Mall here in New York City runs from 70th Street to 170th, and we studied the whole transect looking at how we could recreate a more viable kind of ecological corridor from that simple planting strip. So we think about these things in a typological way and in a kind of index, and we put together things that as we're designing, this is for a particular project, Moynihan Station in New York, it's the kind of new Amtrak station, and we were thinking about both the public plazas around the building and the rooftops and the different activities that they might be able to support. And rather than thinking in plan and drawing in plan and determining this needs to go here and this needs to go there, coming up with like an open, accessible way of saying to people, what elements are appealing to you here? How can we kind of work with these ideas and then provide, have you help us provide a location for them and kind of understand what resonates with people and how to then carry that forward into design spaces. So it's really this kind of like survey of the city, kind of understanding that there's all these types of landscape interventions that can be provided. And then we get to kind of understanding like, I think this kind of framework that we're looking to provide to places. Within that is a way of kind of getting away from traditional hierarchies and more formal ways of understanding and approaching cities. I was talking to Matt earlier about Raleigh and its 5 squares, similar to Philadelphia, where I grew up, and its 5 squares. And in a way, I'm much more interested in the smaller spaces and in the spaces kind of in between. And when I go to cities, I wander and I get out a bike and I, kind of explore the city. And I was really inspired when I was in grad school by Guy Debord, who wrote The Theory of the Derivé, which was really like a mode of experimental behavior that linked the conditions of urban society, a technique of rapid passage through varied ambiences. So what he's talking about, I think, is really kind of getting people together, wandering through the city, being pushed and pulled by the things that inspire you, and maybe not the traditional hierarchies of kind of wayfinding that are prescribed for you. And I'm very interested in that as a way of creating novel space and a way of creating spaces that are more accessible and informal and make people feel much more comfortable. Also really inspirational in this regard is a film by Andrei Tarkovsky called The Stalker. And here, they say in the film, the shortest path isn't the simplest. The more indirect, the less risk there is. It's a kind of metaphysical journey that they go on into what's called, it's kind of like this zone where nature exists, and they go through this kind of metaphysical passage of wandering to try to find the meaning of life. And so I think kind of embedded within some of these inspirations are these kind of futuristic visions of the city where nature is really kind of taken over, almost in like a post-Chernobyl kind of way of what happens in the kind of absence of people. And so as we go through our work, I'm going to look at these things chronologically, roughly, so you can see the way that we're kind of jumping back and forth between research, between design, and between making as a way of just kind of, it's like a feedback loop that begins to kind of really inform our process and our thinking. So this was our office in Gowanus, Brooklyn in 2009, and we just simply highlighted the weeds growing in front of our sidewalk. It's a huge area where stormwater management is a major issue. There's combined sewer outflows just a block away. And so we're thinking about what are these prostrate plants in the sidewalk doing in terms of slowing down that first flush of water and providing this kind of micro infrastructure. And then, we're plants people, right? And I didn't know what any of these plants were. And so that felt like somehow disingenuous. And so, by kind of highlighting them, kind of taking a highlighter to the streetscape in a way, we wanted to kind of reveal their inherent beauty and I think make people question perhaps their ecological value to the city. And so we photographed a lot of them bare-rooted. We researched their cultural histories, understood why they came here, perhaps many of them, roughly a third, were native. So it's not just all invasive plants. Actually, the term invasive is often equated with weeds, but in this particular case of over 200 plants that you often find in cosmopolitan urban environments, only like 2 to 5% of them are actually invasive plants. Things like ailanthus and knotweed, and they're the worst of them, mugwort. But I think at the same time, many of those came over here for particular reasons, and there's deep embedded histories within each of those plants. So at the same time that we're doing that, we're working on design projects. And so this is a new building that went up in Manhattan. We were really inspired by a visit to the local quarry. The whole facade of the building is a bluestone, so it's a local material. So the quarry was up in Ithaca, New York. So these are 24 integrated window boxes into the northern facade of the building, and then a ground floor loggia and planted canopy. And I think over time these have really become well situated, and there was a desire to have it read from the street as a kind of street garden, but there really was an intimacy that needed to be provided to the planting design as well. These are outside people's bedrooms and living rooms, and so there's a kind of duality that we were looking to achieve there. But these also, I think, can become kind of ecological ladders, right? These are not just kind of static elements. These connect to the street, to the canopy, to the window boxes, and even to the roof. And we found all sorts of pollinators and things kind of emerging up through those spaces. We even looked at unique ways of integrating the plants into the parapet detail. And thinking about how to really effectively waterproof that. So hopefully a lot of these things look effortless, but there's a deep kind of engineering that went into the weight load, the drainage, the irrigation to kind of make these things really viable. And after 10 years, it's still looking really great. So jumping back and forth, we kept kind of coming back to spontaneous urban plants and exploring that in different ways. So in 2013, we looked at this project where we could use Instagram in the, I guess, maybe early days, I don't know. But in a way, it was like early to me, to be able to like hashtag in Instagram spontaneous urban plants. So you could take a photograph, right, with your iPhone or whatever, hashtag it spontaneous urban plants and post it to Instagram. And for a couple of years, we were able to kind of troll that hashtag, and then we're able to map that and create a kind of index and living database of weeds in the city. And it really became kind of a fun way of kind of exploring the city as well. So we went on these kind of photographic walks, these kind of dérivés of wandering through the city, where we let the kind of inspiration of plants push and pull us through. And we explored each of the 5 boroughs and kind of mapped what we found. Again, kind of pulled out those kind of typological conditions of where those plants were growing, and then looked at how we could begin to kind of like do subtle moves to switch and kind of optimize those conditions. So by adding water, by increasing circulation, by adding light, by removing particular plants. So sometimes designed by a process of subtraction. I will happily report, I just got back from a trip to Germany, to Berlin. They are designing with weeds everywhere. And it's really inspiring to see how these kind of ideas have really begun to take root. And they're creating and cultivating spaces that have a similar kind of wildness to them in the city. And I don't know, what that does to people psychologically, but for me, like the breakdown of formality is helpful to kind of feeling at peace and finding like a sense of psychological, calm. So another project with DDG Partners, our architect on 41 Bond as well. It's 345 Meatpacking. So here we looked at, all of these original photos are kind of looking at the inspiration. And this is what the Meatpacking district looked like in the 90s in New York. And you had these kind of canopies over, often like loading docks for buildings. And so that was really the inspiration here. With the architect, we explored like this, again, this kit of parts, right? We can do canopies, we can do planted parapets, we can do, window boxes. And these are the kind of things that stuck. And I think, the key was this kind of 50-foot long by 10-foot wide marquee that was visible again, throughout the season. So we wanted to really carefully calibrate the planting selection. Almost like an orchestral type of way, where different things emerge at different times. And, be able to cultivate that on the thinnest amount of soil profile possible. So here we range from 4 inches to 20 inches deep, and the 20 inches support some of the larger sumac trees and upright junipers, and you're able to really cultivate, after a couple of years, this greater sense of wild. So there's all sorts of planting strategies that we can use to achieve that. Often we're planting smaller material in these kind of green roof conditions, and it gives it the capacity to evolve over time and really fill in and get situated within that low soil volume. You can thin these trees out as well, so they're suckering trees. So we can remove branches that get too large or overburdened and allow other things to flourish over the time. So it's a regenerative tree that was chosen specifically for this type of condition. And then these unique moments that the architect created to create visual kind of transparency to the garden and have even some of the plants kind of spill through and become part of your street experience. At the rooftops, in New York, after Hurricane Sandy in 2012, all the mechanical systems of buildings went off into the roofs, and so we're looking at how to really soften some of those facades and provide these vertical green armatures that could become kind of backdrops to more, fancy penthouse type of environments. Our work at the Brooklyn Children's Museum with Toshiko Mori Architects was really looking at a 20,000 square foot rooftop. It was a really fun space. I took my own kids here a lot. TMA was responsible for this open air canopy, which is here under construction. And Future Green was responsible for kind of all the FF&E, the kind of spaces underneath the canopy, that everything needed to be temporary or movable. But we were able to get these larger kind of installations done of the natural woodland garden and kind of open green space. So the plan breaks down into quadrants that relate back to interior program. The overall building was designed by Raphael Vignoli in the 90s. It's a big L-shaped building. And the native woodland garden has clerestory windows next to it, which allow it to be visible from the lobby and kind of beckon people up to the rooftop. Here, it's one of these things where you're looking at like, it's not just about ecology, right? It's about people, and it's about how to make people comfortable in a space that needs to be dynamic. And so we were tasked with looking at like how this space would really shift over time, from a rental wedding situation on a Saturday night to a kind of Sunday afternoon play space. So everything was movable, stackable, and storable. We start out with these kind of really open, loose renderings, and here's some of the final result. Using a black locust timber and creating a kind of natural play space destination amidst the kind of magnolia and sassafras grove. And it has really become, a cultural melting spot for Brooklyn. It's located at, in central Brooklyn, where a lot of different communities come together. So this is a drumming festival, but they hold all sorts of events up there, and it's really been fun to go and see how people utilize it. So we created this website, spontaneousurbanplants.org, which again allows you to kind of take that photograph. It's now defunct, I'm sorry to say, but it was up for about 5 years, and we were able to use it to create this kind of database of weeds in the city. And it was a really fun research project for the office, again to kind of understand where these plants were existing and why. And so a number of people participated in it. And I think, for us, it was a way of engaging with people through a kind of digital platform and getting people who maybe not, interested in plants to kind of start to look at their urban environment around them. And so we did a lot of outreach with community groups and with school groups, leading weed walks and discovering plants in the city, and it was really fun. And that became the kind of basis of our book. So again, some of those mappings. So these are from the book, Spontaneous Urban Plants, where we did this kind of photographic index of plants and then talked about the different ecological values that they could bring to the city. Even things like ailanthus, the dreaded ailanthus, right? But in particular areas, this does provide quick growing carbon sequestration. So it's complicated. It's not all weeds are wonderful. This plant creates a lot of degradation in many environments. But I think we have to be open to considering that there's a greater kind of cosmopolitan flora that really is thriving in cities around the world. And so you'll find these particular plants in cities throughout the world. And many of them are, highly valuable to wildlife. And so I think we have to kind of understand that not all weeds are wonderful, that there's a role that designers can play in the kind of management of those systems, right? Our role as designers doesn't need to necessarily end when the project and punch list gets signed off on, right? That there can be a management program that we write into place to better kind of allow particular plants to grow and thrive that have greater ecological value. We worked at the Rockefeller Center Channel Gardens for 3 years, doing a series of temporary kind of tactical urbanism interventions. Many people don't know that Rockefeller Center was the site of David Hosack's botanical garden, which is New York's first botanical garden. It's a great story that's out in American Eden, a book by Victoria Jackson. And he collected plants from around the world. And so in 2018, we wanted to kind of look at that and celebrate that and use the kind of lost plants of Manhattan. We worked with the New York Botanic Garden to identify a number of plants which have disappeared from the original kind of plant censuses that were taken in the 16 and 1700s of Manhattan, and bring some of those plants back into cultivation. And so it was a really fun project to be a part of. And we did a series of, for 3 years, native plant installations in their channel gardens. And with that, also then creating our kind of own brand of design build, kind of furniture and things like that, which I think help people connect with their urban environment. So here, using this tulip poplar bark material, which is, many people know, it comes from North Carolina. It's a byproduct of the lumber industry, and so it's a waste material that gets panelized. Bark House was the supplier here, and really cool material that we've had a lot of fun working with. So we did things like pop-up beaches and benches, and really creating spaces that New Yorkers would love and use, and not just tourists. Something that would really encourage people to linger and really feel a sense of space. In what traditionally is a quite formal, floral display. And so this was really interesting to bring this kind of wild native plant palette here and have people be okay with it, I think. And then again, create informal places, not just traditional New York City park benches, but places that people can lay back and feel comfortable, and just appreciate the beauty around them. So our team, really has a lot of fun, had a lot of fun doing these installations. We did 5 a year: spring, summer, fall, holiday, and winter. And we did 3 years, so it was 15 of them. Each one was brand new and unique. And then we had a really quick process to make it. So, this is what we do, and this is what really keeps it really fun. Is, for me at least, as a designer, to be able to kind of be connected to this every day. And I think for our staff as well, there's a process of learning that people get. It might be passive, it might be active, but there's a way of kind of just seeing these processes unfold that's really exciting. And designers kind of learn through that process of making things quickly. And sometimes you make mistakes, and that's part of it. And I think that's okay. And I think I've learned so much by all those mistakes that have been made. So here's Simon. Yes, Simon's mom is here tonight. Simon's in North Carolina. Is he NC State? Okay. We're happy to have 2 Raleigh future greeners, Dan Tompkins as well. So, I think what's really fun, again, is I think being able to have a culture that supports all these different types of people, people that make things, people that design things, plants people, and we come together and in this particular case, install these overnight. From 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., we take out everything and we put it in, and it looks like it was never, it was never done before. So it's really fun. It's quite exhausting, and that's one of the reasons why we're not doing it anymore. But it's every time it rains, every single time. So we learned to do laminated planting charts, and have everything on a particular sheet, and each person is assigned to a bed, and we really got it down to a science. But yeah, every time it rains. And so this has been a really fun but challenging process to go through. But again, we find people using these just 15 minutes after we were done. Somebody sat down and started using the space, and that's pretty awesome and fun to see. So at the same time we're doing that, we're doing this. We're literally pivoting day to day, month to month, back and forth. And in this particular case, this is an art show that we were asked to be a part of at Morris Adjemi Architects' office. And so we did a series of pieces, some photographs of a lot of our spontaneous urban plants, but also a series of installations. This particular piece is called Road Cut, and it took a 3-foot by 3-foot section of concrete and put it on an elevated pedestal of rebar with a mirrored under finish, so you could, as you stand next to it, see the kind of underside of the concrete. And it's a commentary, or meant to be a commentary, on just the way we've covered the earth with this very thin and very, extensive strata of concrete and asphalt, but it's had these huge outsized effects on the way that our earth performs. And so just the simple, situating nature on a pedestal, right? This is the nature that we've created. And so we just want to objectify it in the same way that we're objectifying the plants, right? By putting a yellow circle around them, or by photographing them in a botanical way. It's the same idea. It's just repositioning. And so in this particular case, these were totems that we called the imagined realities, as if they were like core samples that had been extracted from a future kind of condition, that just looked at all of the layers and strata that we had put down as humans, and then the kind of embedded layers within them. Again, inspired by a lot of books and a lot of reading, fiction, and plays a big part of my life. I think in the way that I approach landscape was probably informed a lot by reading a lot as a kid and just kind of imagining all these spaces. But we kind of constantly come back to these touchstones. We try to support research actively in our office through a budget, which is the starting point. And then, that research forms and informs these kind of art and exploratory projects. We also look to frame and kind of depict a series of studies that we did for the Amant Foundation, which is another project I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But these concrete samples, we're looking at how could we create this kind of hybrid concrete surface that could become host to plants over time. So we embedded materials that could be subtracted. So this one is butter in it, which is really fun. We're thinking about things that could hold a void, but then be subtracted through some processes later. Rock salt, burlap, all sorts of different materials and straw and things like that became the basis, which are then heated up or extracted to create this kind of living surface. And so, those studies were for this particular project. This one, Building of the Year with Soil Architects. It's a small art gallery in a very industrial neighborhood of Brooklyn. You would never expect, when they told me that the project site was here, I was like, are you sure? Because next door was a chicken processing plant, and there's blood on the sidewalk and stuff, and it was really gross. It was really gross. And originally we were like, okay, well, we're gonna do our weeds thing. It's a post-industrial area. We're gonna kind of play with that and use gravel and all these existing materials and reposition them. I think we ended up going a much more different route than that and doing a kind of highly curated garden. But the really interesting thing that the architects set up here is there's 3 different addresses to the property, and you really are able to, through a series of shifting volumes, really work your way through the gallery and find these really secret open spaces. It's a really quite cool space. And so we were looking at how to create these unique garden moments within these spaces that were unexpected, and again, maybe plants that were unexpected, so that a gardener would know, a plants person would know, ooh, that's not supposed to be there, that's unique. And I think those kind of subtle things help play off of some of the architectural interventions. At the same time, we were reading books like Richard Powers' The Overstory. I don't know if anyone else has read that. One of my favorite books. And thinking about the interconnectedness of plants and how we could create potential plant relationships we could reinforce these connections that exist within nature. And so Nancy Seiter, our horticulturist, is really an amazing plants person. And we really thought about how we could kind of begin to kind of pair together matrices or a system of plants to function in that way. And so the job sites, start out like this. It's pretty heavily compacted soil, but eventually, we're able to till that and, form out a patio within the interior of the space that then gets poured into concrete. You can see some of the larger trees at the edges. Some trees kind of being delivered in this very kind of post-industrial sidewalk condition. And then, over time, seeing those things kind of fill in. So, using plants like sourwood here, which, it's much more common down here than up north, or catalpa or sassafras, things that were really not expected to be in this very urban environment. I think were playful and surprising and create a kind of unique series of spaces. Oh, great, Franklinia trees as well. Some things are, quite delicate and needed to be managed. But in this kind of condition, we're, really have thrived. So our project at St. John's Terminal, this was the original terminus for the High Line in New York. It had been a UPS building. You can see Houston Street kind of diving into the building there, and then the West Side Highway here on the right. And so the architects have kind of, Cook Fox architects have kind of revealed the structure of the building and kind of sliced off that to open up Houston Street to the sky. And then you can see through the series of train beds where we're kind of doing these elevated gardens. So it's a public plaza, raised 6 feet to accommodate some of the flooding issues we have along the riverfront. And then you've got gardens at the second floor level, and then window boxes all the way up the building. You can see we're trying to kind of make spaces for people and for plants, and to negotiate these grade transitions in a way that slips the pathways beyond them and yet still opens up those terrace opportunities for seating. The plan here of the public plaza, and then the overall roof plan over 90,000 square feet, a little bit over 2 acres of office terrace space. That's going to be a great addition to the lower west side of Manhattan. Congregation spaces for events. Many of these draw off of regional precedents. So we looked at the whole transect of the river, the Hudson River, from New York all the way up to the Hudson Highlands, and each floor of the building picks up on the ecology of a different kind of zone. From what is called the kind of Valley of the Flowers, the Blumendal, or where Bloomingdale's got its name, which is a valley of flowers on the upper west side, all the way up to the Hudson Highlands and Breakneck Ridge, which we're trying to kind of encapsulate here through these stubby pines, post oaks, and expressed boulders. And then obviously spaces for people. It's an office environment, so trying to think about how we can create an office environment which allows people to still relax and be able to take in the views of the city. So this is it coming together. You can see what we've really worked with a regional stone in New York. This is Corinthian granite from Champlain stone. And we've used that same stone in the paving, in the retaining walls, and in the boulders. The boulders were hand-selected, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The paving is large, is a large pattern that repeats itself. There's actually only 3 different types of pavers that get replicated, but they are in a large flower pattern, which I don't have the best picture of here, but that gets replicated into different sizes. So we picked out these boulders in the middle of winter through a series of visits, but it was really fun. We literally kind of picked parts of the mountain, and they pulled them out, and we thought about how each of these could become pieces which could reinforce some of the design moves that we had been making. But to get them to be accurate and to kind of work with this kind of natural material, we looked to kind of trace these different systems. There was, we first traced them to get their footprint so we could put them in the plan. We had a lot of really tight thresholds with egress and fire code that we needed to meet with the interior, going in and out of the plaza. So in addition to getting their footprint, we also 3D scanned each of the boulders. And then we had to index all of the boulders, which was quite an elaborate process. So this is actually the tracing paper, which was then scanned in. And then many of the boulders are actually bollards. So they get drilled out and reinforced with steel. So what you're seeing, the 2 holes are actually drill holes that get put into the bollards and then essentially get elevated onto steel. So you can see the custom cut steel following the outline of the custom cut boulder. So this is really situating nature on a pedestal. It's a totally constructed reality. But one is coming together, and these things serve a security purpose, right? But yet they look naturalistic, and they've kind of been embedded into the landscape. So for us, it was a very energy intensive and quite difficult process, but we think it's really exciting to see the kind of result come together. So I'm going to end on this project, a local project here. Again, we've had the opportunity to work on with S9 Stewart and LS3P architects. The Peden Steelworks is a site that had been here for a long time, and there are a lot of relics still when we toured the original building. I don't have a lot of great photographs. I actually had meant to put them in here, and in my haste, didn't. But we were able to salvage a lot of the steel elements, like these truss work on the left, and a lot of the canopies over the buildings, and a lot also of large kind of concrete blocks, which form the kind of basis of the design. So overall, we've got 2 buildings. The building on the left is a residential building, and the building on the right is the existing ironworks building. We've cut out a big piece of the building and opened it up to natural air, and that's where the central courtyard is. And then there's a series of kind of publicly accessible open spaces all around the building that are quite playful in their intent. So you could see the reclaimed concrete blocks really distributed throughout benches, seating, and retaining walls. A way of just creating informality to the site. There's a large slide which brings you down from the 2nd level to the 1st level. A way of just incorporating play into that general public scape. Tunnels that you can go through, salvaged large diameter tunnels to kind of just move through and experience the landscape in different ways, and a lot of other salvaged truss work that was going to provide signage and lighting and other things like that to the space. Gabion walls that integrate native stone and a ton of perennial and grass mixes and native trees. So I got a couple of photographs here. This is the courtyard. So the courtyard has started to be planted. It looks kind of sad because it's really hot. We could talk about, I'm happy to talk about this project, and it's always difficult when contractors tell you they can plant in July and August. But I think, we look to plant with a real tight density. There's always compromises that have to be made on projects, and often planting density is one of the things that gets whacked first. But I think, the climate here is such that things really do take off and grow in very quickly. And I think we're going to see some great coverage pretty quickly. We're able to use a lot of the existing floor. This is something that you got to have an owner who believes in you working with this material. So this is the existing floor material that we had them cut into 3 foot by 3 foot squares, salvage for a couple of years, and then bring back and kind of reinstall in the same space. So it looks quite beautiful. We were able to get the drains to be kind of integrated into it. And I think it's going to be a really nice space for the city. So I'm going to stop there just in the essence of time, but happy to take and discuss any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.
All right, it's working tonight. Can I? Oh yeah, we got one leading off right now. I'm ready for you.
So I was wondering, in terms of the Oxford building, how much of the push for the exterior landscape, like the outside on the sidewalk, was that pushed by the developer or the architect, or how much of that is pushed by the city itself? Because I'm thinking of a recent building downtown where it's all concrete straight out to the street, and it's a huge space that could have used something like that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Like, where does the vision for that come from? I wish I could say it was the city or the developer, but in this case, it's Cook Fox Architects. Rick Cook, in particular, are really pushed to have that green entry. It's part of their identity as a firm, is to have architecture kind of with landscape all over it. And so I think it was really important to create an office entry that was going to, again, kind of transition people from the busyness of the city to something that was going to be a little bit calmer and more quiet as an interior environment. So, but really came from the architect's vision.
Thanks. Hey, David. First, thank you for employing my son.
Yeah.
Second, the question of selecting plants and sourcing plants. Can you talk about where you source your plants and what percentage of natives you use? And perhaps with pop-ups, like Rock Center, what do you do with the stuff after the pop-up is done? And where does that plant go? And what's the sustainability strategy? Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah, those are all great questions. The plant sourcing is a really interesting question, and actually our summer interns are researching exactly that issue. So they're researching where not only I know where we get all of our trees in the kind of New York City region, but actually where do those trees come from? And where did the stock material come from? It turns out they all come from like Oregon, and they get trucked over here, and then they get grown to size. So it's quite interesting. There's a huge embedded energy within our planting systems as they are now. That's one of the things that we're trying to unpack as a firm a little bit. Is we're employing a bunch of carbon calculators now with like the Oxford project, which is at Google's new campus in New York. I should have said that. And looking at really like what is the return on investment of those projects, right? As we're kind of extracting that stone from the side of the mountain, how quickly are these plants and landscape solutions that we're providing going to kind of return that investment back to the city? It's not great, It's the energy intensiveness of building landscapes is quite dramatic, and the return on investment is quite long, depending on the project. So it's something that I really implore. There's a number of great tools that have come out from the Landscape Architecture Foundation that are carbon calculators that you can use for your own projects, and it's just going to help inform people to make more educated decisions. In regards to native plants, there's a great movement happening now. People are becoming more receptive to native plants. I don't know if you know the work of Doug Tallamy. He wrote, I believe, The Nature of Oaks, Nature of Oaks, I think is one of his most recent books, but really talking about the homegrown national park, how you can take everybody's own particular yard, and really cultivate natives in your yard. And through, again, this kind of patchwork of yards, we can create this greater system. Our own projects are often 100% native, or sometimes, like in the case of the Amant Foundation, we're really trying to play on like botanical surprises, maybe like, 3/4 native. But we're trying to employ those plants wherever possible. And again, like when we're working outside of New York City, we're really looking at regional landscapes, things that kind of draw particular inspiration, again, for the planting palettes that we create. Forget the last question. Oh, pop-ups, yeah. So Rockefeller Center, we had the opportunity in the first year to work with New York Botanic Garden, and they were able to take many of the plants and put them into community gardens. And so that was a great solution. Daniel Altea, who's one of the head researchers at NYBG, worked with Verde Square on the Upper East Side and was able to take a lot of those plants. In the second and third years, I think they went back to the nurseries because it really becomes like a rotational strategy for those particular planting installations. It's something I think we really have to be careful with in terms of pop-ups. I think pop-ups can add a great, activation to our public spaces and kind of draw people to some space. And you can also then see how people use the space as you're kind of planning a longer term installation. But they come with their kind of embedded cost.
There. Yes, I'm very curious. Speaking of unexpected plants and native plants. Wow, was that me? Okay, at one point, I almost thought I saw a pawpaw tree. Are you exploring in any way the use of edible landscaping?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, always, I think site specificity, I think means everything. So we've done a lot of like urban farms. We are part of like detailing, Brooklyn Grange in New York. We were doing a lot of rooftop farms for affordable housing and community supported kind of agriculture projects. As it gets to edible landscapes, I think it really becomes down to like what the client and is interested in. We've tried to plant pawpaws in particular and haven't had great success. But I think it really comes down to set and setting and what the site requires.
Thank you. I lived in the city at the time that the green dialogue was becoming quite alive during the Bloomberg administration, and amazing things took place, like the recreation of the piers along the West Side Highway as green oases, and many projects planting locust trees to invite in the bee population and making it legal to have honeybee hives, and so many other projects, yes. And the work you're doing is incredibly inspiring. And can you speak also to how wildlife is being invited in, at that time, as things were underway, like with the High Line even, immediately butterflies and raccoons and so many animals seem to get into Manhattan. And I want to also say a few things about the Raleigh situation.
Oh, sure.
I hope that you will continue, that you're able, your vision, and all the other wonderful people here can continue to inspire being as green as possible in this town where there seems to be very little dialogue now about becoming green. The architectural footprints seem to go all the way to the sidewalk now, or all the way to the street, with a very uninspired little tree stuck in a grate, as if it were Midtown Manhattan, and that's not what it is. I was walking in a neighborhood next to, the old neighborhood next to Cameron Village the other day on Hillsborough, with the wonderful magic old houses there. If you grew up here like I did, you know, it has great character, and lots of great characters live there. And there was one house that was an infill, and there's a lot of ancient oak trees there and other native trees. And the lawn in front of that new house, in between old houses with wonderful oak trees, was made of plastic grass, and a palm tree was stuck in the middle of it. We've got to do what we can now that we were on this precipice in Raleigh of huge change with very little vision. How magnificent the Dix project is, and all the beautiful people involved with that, but I think that energy needs to spread around the town, or who knows where we will be in another few years. Thank you for letting me speak.
Well, I think that's a great point. And, you know, luckily you have Michael Van Valkenburg's firm who's, you know, designing the project. And I think they've been pioneers in really creating a native horticultural palette. You know, it's kind of like a hyper-real native. But I think that they've been able to really encourage growers, you know, because that's part of the problem is, like, we can specify sassafras and oxydendron and franklinia and all this stuff, but we can't often get people, we can't find it. We can't get people to grow it at size. There's different problems with each of those things that I just mentioned, but, you know, I think, you know, MVVA has been one of those firms that has really helped push the horticultural industry to really shift their perspective and grow things that maybe aren't straight or aren't particularly clipped, that have character, that have you know, wildness to them, that are straight species, right? You know, a lot of times they go to big nurseries, it's really difficult to find a straight species of a tree. You get tons of cultivars, and, you know, it just doesn't necessarily have the same genetic diversity, right, as our straight species. So I think that there's a lot that this park is going to do, I think, to inspire people. And certainly I've been inspired by their work in terms of the way that we approach our planting design. I think that's probably all we have, or any more questions?
I have one question.
Oh, please.
This week we've been working with the group of students we have here this year with the workshop, trying to uncover aspirational kind of what-if statements for our city. And so I guess I would pose the same question to you in that, what do you find aspirational in the city and in the work you're doing right now? And I guess, what do you hope for moving forward with your, not only your practice, but what you hope to see develop in cities?
It's a great question. That's a difficult one, but I would say the first thing that comes to mind is just to strip down traditional hierarchies, you know, around buildings, around public space, that really marginalizes particular populations of people and makes people really not feel comfortable. We're trying to kind of, I think, through our work, bring like an informality for people, a sense of comfort, a sense of belonging in our public spaces that we create, you know, combined with that kind of really robust ecological, you know, goals and performance that we're trying to meet. So it's about plants, it's about people. I think as we move forward, we're at a critical time where we really need to start using the technology better in service to understanding what our landscapes are doing and how they're performing. So I'm talking about the carbon calculator, but I can go way beyond that. to really understanding how landscapes work and how we can be performance driven in the way that we design things. Is not like, oh, I like this plant better than that plant. It's like, let's figure out how these are working, right? An oak tree, from Doug Talamy's research, provides host to like 430 different species of caterpillars and insects and things like that, where like a tupelo tree is like 20, So there's a reason why you're gonna plant an oak, And so I think the more data that comes out, the more that can really inform our designs. But ultimately, I think it's about creating informal, accessible spaces.
Applause for David Seiter.
Thank you.